Before I get started, keep in mind what I'm about to say is only my opinion. You are free to disagree. While we might disagree, I still very much respect your opinion. All I ask is that you keep it civil in the comments. Okay? Okay. We're all adults here. With that being said, I'm not a fan of Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, which I will be referring to as the Breath Saga. Sounds very appetizing. Breath Saga. Yes, I played the games. I beat Breath of the Wild, then sunk 70 hours into Tears of the Kingdom. In that period of time, I beat 4 of the main story temples before I sold the game. Don't worry, I'll explain why later in the video. Alrighty, with that out of the way, let's begin, ladies and gentlemen, but probably mostly gentlemen. E.G. Al-Numa. A while ago, he said, "It's interesting when I hear people say those things because I'm wondering, why do you want to go back to a type of game where you're more limited or more restricted in the types of things or ways you can play? But I do understand that desire that we have for nostalgia, and so I can also understand it from that aspect." It's not solely about nostalgia. It's about quality over quantity. Bigger does not necessarily mean better. Just ask the girlfriend I don't have. The previous Zelda games did have a much more contained experience, but because of those limitations, the developers could focus on crafting incredible stories, characters, dungeons, boss fights, and music much more efficiently. The map's smaller size was always compensated for by being packed full of meaningful side content and collectibles, all of which made exploration
very rewarding.
Despite that, the world wasn't packed with too much side content or collectibles to the point where it felt overcrowded. One example of really fun side content is fishing, something the Breath Saga doesn't have. Let me give you guys some more in-depth examples as to why traditional Zelda titles are better, at least in my opinion. While the stories within traditional Zelda games and the Breath Saga all share the same basic premise, that being Link finds out he's the chosen hero who must defeat Ganondorf or some other version of him and save Zelda in the process. It's what happens in between where all the magic happens. Literally. The relationships Link has with his allies are one of the driving forces behind why the classic Zelda stories are so damn good. The prologue for Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword are longer than typical Zeldas, although it takes this extra time to flesh out Link and the supporting characters he has bonded with in Orden Village or Skyloft. In Twilight Princess's case, his childhood friend Lila and the younger kids who view him as an older brother figure. In Skyward Sword, Link and Zelda's relationship is handled better than any other Zelda game I've played so far, since unlike other traditional Zelda games, this particular Link and Zelda have history. They grew up together. There's the feeling of a real human connection between the two. The prologue of Wind Waker isn't quite as long as the previous two. Nonetheless, it still takes enough time to let players know Link has a widow sister alongside a grandmother, both of whom he is clearly very close with. A grandmother who, for some reason, is completely fine with her 12-year-old grandson venturing off with a bunch of strangers. Great parenting. When the journey actually starts in all 3 of those games, shit goes down as people get abducted. Because those games took the time to cement the fact that Link is close with those individuals, each of whom have their own wonderful personalities, you actually give a shit about them when they're abducted. Because you give a shit about them, you actually want to save them. Link may be silent, but seeing him transform from plain Jane village boy into a legendary badass, albeit kind-hearted hero who slays monsters a gazillion times his size is one of the best forms of character development I've ever seen. Of course, someone's transition into a hero wouldn't be nearly as impactful if they didn't endure a bunch of hardships along the way. Luckily, Link in traditional Zeldas certainly does. Throughout the entire game's runtime, he is always saving people, even if it means killing a bunch of monsters and risking his own life in the process. He enters massive dangerous temples with a bunch of traps and even more monsters. Yay. Uncovers revelations about himself or others. Sometimes, he even loses. That's a good thing, because you don't always want to see the hero win, otherwise things get boring. They get far too predictable. No matter how harsh, All these trials are necessary as they shape him into the hero he was always meant to be. A lesser man would have thrown in the towel and said, "Fuck it!" The fact Link keeps moving forward, no matter what, simply because he's a good person who wants to save his loved ones, is what makes him one of the greatest characters in gaming. Period. This is what happens when you have excellent writers. Link isn't the only well-written character in the franchise who experiences growth. This extends to the supporting characters who breathe so much life into the world. Midna starts off being a wee little selfish, and she's sassy as fuck. If I'll be completely honest, I do like her sassiness. As you progress through the game, however, you discover she's a much more complex character than you initially realized. She's someone who has her own motivations and set of problems. Not only is she a very well-written character, but she proves to be invaluable throughout the entire game. Personally, I think she's the best sidekick in the entire franchise, and one of the best sidekicks overall in gaming. Unlike a certain annoying little sprite and sword spirit that you want to stomp on until they're nothing more than gore paste. Don't lie, you feel the same way I do about those sons of bitches. Tetra might be bossy. Underneath that bravado though, she does have a caring side. Much like Midna, she too has more to her than meets the eye. Gru starts off as a typical bitch-ass bully, one who looks like a roided Elvis Presley, minus the charisma or talent. As the main narrative advances, he actually goes through a Steve Harrington arc. In short, he stops being a tremendous dickhead. There's no shortage of awesome villains either. Zant is a very unstable, petulant, albeit terrifying usurper who was tired of being a lackey, so he made a deal with a god in order to become the self-proclaimed king of the Twilight. Girahim, well, he's just a fucking loony, with no grasp of the concept of personal space whatsoever. He's really fun to watch on screen, his craziness, he's like the Joker. Ganondorf is always depicted as a masturbator, manipulator. A power-hungry tyrant who is the perfect antithesis to Link. One thing I dislike about traditional Zelda games is they typically throw in some annoying-ass mandatory fetch quest to artificially extend each game's runtime. Wind Waker has the Triforce shards, Skyward Sword has the stupid fucking windmill propeller and entering the first temple again to retrieve special water for that slutbag water dragon, as it's the only way you can heal her. Twilight Princess has the Tears of Light. In Twilight Princess's case, I didn't actually mind collecting the Tears of Light, as they are a lot easier to find than the Triforce shards, windmill propeller, and magic water. Additionally, exploring a realm bathed in twilight is actually pretty cool, as it gives off some Metroid Prime 2 vibes. On the other hand, the escort mission in Twilight Princess can fuck off properly. Every single game within the Zelda franchise has its own art style, making every entry unique, yet equally as enjoyable in their own right. Twilight Princess, with its more gritty, realistic art style, Wind Waker has cel-shaded graphics, giving off a more kid-friendly appearance, while the visuals for Skyward Sword are said to be a mix of Twilight Princess and Wind Waker. I'd say the developers exceeded in that case. Each traditional Zelda title is made even more impactful by the fantastic music that you hear throughout the games. Music that invokes a plethora of different emotions, whether it's calmness, an epic, grand sense of adventure, hectic, sad, tragic, or even creepy as fuck. One of my main issues with the Breath saga was the lack of meaningful storytelling. Breath of the Wild did most of its storytelling through flashbacks, many of which were optional for some reason. Tears of the Kingdom fares slightly better than its predecessor in that regard. The narrative relies less on telling events through flashbacks and more on telling them in the present. The prologue with Ganon in Tears of the Kingdom was really well done, largely due to Ganondorf's depiction in Tears being far better than it was in the prequel, as Ganon this time around is much closer in line to his usual incarnations. The final battle with Ganon is much better as well. Even if I didn't beat the game, I still saw the final battle on YouTube. With that being said, the storyline for Tears of the Kingdom isn't nearly as good as traditional Zelda games' storylines. Even if this Link and Zelda have history, their relationship seems to be exclusively,
"He's my bodyguard."
Honestly, I don't feel a genuine connection between Link and Zelda or the rest of the supporting cast for that matter. Everything just feels so damn wooden in comparison. I feel this way because the writing isn't nearly as good, mixed with neither of the two games slowing things down and properly focusing on fleshing out these relationships, at least not to the same extent as traditional Zelda games do. Link doesn't start off as some regular villager. He doesn't endure hardships at the same level as Link usually does. We don't see him change. He's just plopped into a massive open world map and basically told, you'll figure it out. Alongside this particular Link, no supporting character in the Breath Saga stood out to me, save for Ganon. During the 70-hour time slot with Tears of the Kingdom, and I believe I spent around the same amount of time on Breath of the Wild, I can't recall a single time where either game had an emotional, gut-wrenching moment, a cool revelation, or some genuinely good character development. My voice cracked there. Sorry about that. The Breath Saga does a very good job at making you care about the characters in the least amount a human possibly can. I'll at least give both games credit for having proper voice acting, unlike traditional Zelda games. Unfortunately, the lines typically sound like they were delivered by someone who was forcefully woken up and wanted to be anywhere else but inside that recording booth, especially Zelda.
We've been descending for a while now. These tunnels are deeper than I thought. What could be down here?
As for the music, some of the soundtracks, while not nearly as good as traditional Zelda's soundtracks, are still legitimately solid, like the one within the Sky Islands, or the one you hear within temples. I like how the theme within each temple starts off as being more on the foreboding side, but gradually becomes more hopeful sounding as you progress through the temple. You know what's not solid though? Having to hear the same imprisoning war story over and over again. Nintendo could have had each character tell the story from a different perspective, making each sage come off as a truly unique individual. But nope! Comparing gameplay between the two, I will say there are some things the Breath Saga does better. For starters, there's a lot more freedom, as in the Breath Saga has a choose-your-own-adventure kind of approach. That extends throughout every facet of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Whether it's what order you tackle temples in, how you approach combat encounters, or how you traverse the world. The Breath Saga has way more weapon types you can choose from than traditional Zelda games. The fusibility in Tears of the Kingdom, on the other hand, enhances the combat by creating an endless amount of possibilities. The same can be said for traversal, which also relies heavily on the fusing gimmick. Compare this to the combat and traversal in traditional Zelda games, and it's a hell of a lot more simplistic in comparison. Still enjoyable, just not nearly as exhilarating as using a fire-breathing shield, killing a group of enemies while they're sleeping, fighting an army of monsters with your fellow men, using your paraglider, phasing through ceilings, or flying on a poorly constructed machine of your own design. But combat in the Breath Saga has one huge glaring flaw. Oh, I think you know what it is. Weapon durability. Even with the newly added fuse mechanic in Tears of the Kingdom, weapons still break too damn quickly or easily, as do any of the contraptions you make, even if you can extend the duration of how long specific transportation can be used with Zonai batteries. The battery still depletes at a rapid pace, like as quickly as a male rabbit busts a nut. The building mechanic all around feels like a giant clusterfuck. This is made especially apparent during the egregious fairy armor upgrade side quests. At least in traditional Zelda games, whatever weapons you obtain throughout the story, you got to keep forever and ever. Every time you find a really powerful, rare weapon you worked hard to obtain in the Breath Saga, on the other hand, you can't even use the thing without it breaking shortly after. If you could at least repair your weapons, much like you can in Days Gone, then I'd be much more forgiving towards it. But you can't. Terrible idea, Nintendo. Terrible. On a side note, during combat encounters, the frame rate in Tears of the Kingdom chugs more than an alcoholic stepdad. They greatly expanded the world within Tears of the Kingdom, with new areas like the Sky Islands, the Depths, or the shitload of caves in Hyrule. My problem is, the world feels too damn big for its own good. There is an overabundance of shrines and Korok seeds that made both Breath of the Wild and Tears especially feel like a giant fucking checklist. I'm playing a game, not going grocery shopping, and it certainly doesn't help that all the shrines share the same aesthetic. And many of the Korok seeds are a pain in the dick to obtain. It all ends up feeling like a chore to play. That's why I sold Tears of the Kingdom in the first place. They focused so much on making the world bigger that something was lost along the way. The biggest example being crafting an unforgettable story. The problem is, the bigger a map is, the harder it becomes to fill it with meaningful content, as seen with the overabundance of repetitive side activities. My point is, sometimes less is more. Speaking of side content, it's pretty unremarkable in the Breath Saga, with most of them boiling down to tedious fetch quests. Typically, any compensation you obtain by completing them isn't worth the effort. These rewards usually include obtaining stew, some rubies, or a new weapon. Yeah, a weapon that'll break as soon as you start using it. Yippee. You're better off getting most of those things by exploring. Like I said beforehand, the fairy armor upgrade quests are dreadful. Ugh, gives you PTSD. They were made far worse in Tears of the Kingdom due to the literal hurdles you must go through to actually accomplish them. And you can't exactly afford to not get those upgrades. Otherwise, you'll end up getting your ass pounded like a fresh fish in prison. Side quests in traditional Zelda games, on the other hand, would always reward you with some cool permanent upgrade, such as a heart piece or container, a bigger quiver, bomb bag, or wallet for holding rubies. While the world has been greatly expanded and the new areas were fun to explore at first, it gets boring really quickly once you realize each of the areas look the same, especially the depths in Hyrule. Hyrule looks exactly the same as it did in the prequel. That's just lazy, and it took them 6 years to make this game too. Excuse me, my burp agrees. You can do better. We say you can do better, so do it. Do it now. If I'm not mistaken, there's only one new settlement in the entire game, and it's in Hyrule of all places. They should have at least added 2 additional settlements, one in the sky and one in the depths. Here's how I think they should have handled it. Hyrule should have sunk into the depths at the start of the game. That way it would be a nice mix of old and new. Whenever you explore the depths, you would see once thriving locations transformed into destroyed husks of their former selves. Kinda like Castletown in the future timeline of Ocarina of Time. Many of the NPCs you saw in Breath of the Wild would be roaming around the depths as newly transformed freaky-ass zombie-like creatures, much like Ganon was at the beginning of Tears of the Kingdom. You would spend a large portion of Tears of the Kingdom in the sky, where all the biomes would have really bizarre, unique, otherworldly themes, as opposed to all sharing the same piss-colored, grass-covered theme. Now, I'll be comparing dungeons between the Breath Saga and traditional Zelda games. The temples in Breath of the Wild all share the same aesthetic and are incredibly short. To make matters worse, every boss residing within those temples looked exactly the same, and the fights themselves sucked! There really wasn't much strategy, except for just using your weapons, but there was no item that you could use against them that you typically use against a boss that you required earlier on in the dungeon, because, that's not a thing in the Breath Saga, unfortunately. In Tears of the Kingdom, the temples are all at least unique this time around, as are the bosses residing within them. The boss fight quality was improved as well. There are some segments within temples that really make you think outside of the box, especially with how you use the fuse ability in order to solve specific puzzles. With that being said, none of these temples are nearly as good as traditional Zelda temples in terms of intricacy, aesthetic, or puzzles. Each of the temples in Tears involves activating 4 switches, then facing the boss. The temples are not much longer than they were in the prequel either. Compare them to the temples in traditional Zelda games, those of which are the perfect length. They all had their own unique themes, challenges, and plenty of puzzles. There was a mini-boss residing within each dungeon. Upon defeating them, you received an item, usually a weapon of some sort. These items you acquired within each dungeon were used very effectively throughout the rest of the temple's duration, especially against the bosses, which are leaps and bounds better than any boss in the Breath Saga, both from a design and execution standpoint. Let me give you some examples. The Arbiter's Grounds in Twilight Princess is an abandoned prison filled with a multitude of undead monsters, sandpits, and spike traps. It makes clever use of your wolf transformation, as there are switches that can only be unearthed by Wolf Link. When you pull them, they reveal secret rooms. These rooms typically house Poes, who have to be defeated in order to progress further inside the temple. Even the mini-boss, of the temple relies heavily on using the scent ability. Stallard is the boss of the Arbiter's Grounds, and he is an incredible boss that makes better use of the dungeon item than any other dungeon item against any other boss in the game. A goddamn Beyblade. Skyward Sword has the Ancient Cistern, with its very clearly Buddhist-inspired theme. The temple itself takes inspiration from a short story known as The Spider's Thread. The upper level of the temple most likely represents paradise, a celestial realm of a Buddha. The depths of the temple, on the other hand, are a massive contrast from the beautiful, almost tranquil-like upper level, as it's a dark, hellish, zombified, infested pit, complete with a very eerie soundtrack. Welcome to hell, motherfucker. They even implemented the titular Spider's Thread short story within this hellscape in a clever way. The dungeon caps off with one of the franchise's best boss fights. Koloktos is a living golem-like statue inspired by an Azura. You have to pull off its arms like an action figure and use its own sword against it. As during the second phase, its own weapon is the only means you can destroy the cage, guarding the monster's heart. And then once you destroy the cage, with the sword, you're able to damage the heart outright. Hardcore as shit, man! Wind Waker has the Tower of the Gods, where many of the rooms have water levels that are fluctuating. A bit later on in the dungeon, you gain the ability to control statues, which help you solve certain puzzles. The boss in this particular dungeon, Godin, is the weakest of the three examples I gave in terms of how good it is. My opinion. I still think it's a pretty solid fight, as you have to use both your arrows and bombs in order to defeat Godin. Bosses in traditional Zeldas require strategy. Using an ally's abilities during a boss fight is a cool concept. Unfortunately, the execution in Tears of the Kingdom is very mixed. The Wind Temple boss made good use of your ally's ability, while the Fire, Water, and Lightning Temple, yeah, not so much. By the way, the Sage abilities, to me, are a big old bowl of meh. Tulins and Unibos were the only ones I actually enjoyed using, as the others weren't very useful from a traversal standpoint. Unibo might admittedly be my favorite, as he proves to be really helpful during combat encounters. Even with those two interesting Sage powers, they aren't comparable to the items you acquire in traditional Zelda temples, which are just a lot more fun to use, and they're used effectively throughout the game, whether it's in the overworld to gain access to secrets you couldn't beforehand, or even using them in exceeding dungeons as well. Here's what I think. If any other developer made this game, then I think people would be far more critical of it. Nintendo, on the contrary, gets a free pass because, well, they're Nintendo. No game publisher or developer is immune to criticism, not even Nintendo. At least with Breath of the Wild, it was the first in a new franchise. So everything was nice and sparkly. It was, oh, this is really interesting to explore. Tears of the Kingdom, on the other hand, relies on reusing assets far too much. To me, Tears of the Kingdom feels less like a 2.0 and more like a 1.5. I'm sure I'll get a lot of heat for saying this, but I like to live dangerously. I enjoyed Immortals Phoenix Rising more than I enjoyed the Breath Saga. And that's a Ubisoft game, for God's sake. The reason being is because the world isn't too big, there are no breakable weapons, dungeons are much better designed, and traversal is a lot more enjoyable, as is the final boss battle. Jesse, if you don't like it, just play the older games. Ugh. Why can't Nintendo have two teams working on Zelda games? One working on another Breath Saga title, while the other can make a Zelda game that is more in line with previous entries. And I don't just mean a remake of an older Zelda game either. I mean a brand new traditional Zelda game. That way, everyone wins and no one is left behind. Alnuma's statement makes it sound as if traditional Zeldas are a thing of the past, as if they won't be made anymore. Fact is, if it wasn't for the traditional Zelda games, then people like Alnuma would have never been able to make the Breath Saga at all. And I'm betting a lot of people spent way more time overall playing traditional Zelda games than they did the Breath Saga. And despite all my criticisms, by no means am I saying Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom are bad games. They're not bad games.